It's the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast, everyone's favourite podcast to do with witchcraft, the occult, and magic, and troublemaking, essentially. Today, we're going to be talking about all sorts of internal issues and such, I think. This is
Perfect for
episode
the season of obligation.
for the season of obligation. Yeah, we are. This is being released on the lead up to Christmas, which is winter time, just before the new year. And the subject today, although we probably should know better than to talk about this, shadow work, Chris. OMG.
Yes, my least favourite subject.
Is it your least favourite subject?
Yeah, I hate talking about shadow work. I'm fine talking about other people's shadow work.
You hate talking about it. You like it, or you think it's useful. You just don't like talking about your own shadow work, no?
No.
Can you talk about your own shadow work?
Of course I can. I can talk about anything, Liam. You make sure of that every week. Okay. Regardless of whether or not I want to talk about them or not.
So this one's going to be one of those podcast episodes where certain people will be hanging on our every fucking word, right?
Yeah, because they all need to seriously do some.
So we're going to have to outline shadow work like super seriously, aren't we? This is going to have to be like one of those serious episodes, isn't it? I can feel it already. So can you explain to us what shadow work is? And then maybe explain what it is not, or I'll explain what it is not, depending on, whether you can think of some funny examples.
What I should say. Well, my natural thought to say everybody will think about the word or the phrase shadow work and think of Carl Jung. So that's where the concept of shadow work for most people in the New Age variety, for them to all focus on the Carl Jungian idea of what shadow work is, that kind of soul searching, giving yourself a long, hard stare in the mirror, not the pocket mirror, but the actual one that you look at your whole self in, not just individual parts. So most people will then kind of stretch that to kind of some kind of past life work is what they tend to go straight to, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of where I kind of don't like the conversations that we end up having to have at that point. Because ultimately for me, in a nutshell, is that reflective work of, so if we were to look at the tree of life, we'd be looking at kind of, our solid self is the kind of terror. And then if you kind of go up that line, you have the kind of lunar self, and then the solar self, and then that Pluto self. I'm going to go there, Liam.
The abyss. Oh, it sends a chill down my spine, Chris.
So most people tend to have a look up that tree in that kind of way. And most people will kind of go, oh, well, I go and explore my lunar self all the time in my dreams and shit, because they only think about the kind of subconscious and that kind of aspect that Jung has kind of pull out, where we talk about stereotypes and we talk about all those kind of signifiers in our dream space and kind of dreamscaping and astral work. Whereas to me, what shadow work is more about is about that solar self, and actually looking at the reflection that solar self leads. So that kind of shadow that is left by the solar self. So you kind of go through that kind of shadow work to kind of start to explore the concept of what your solar self is. So for most people, they're looking at the shadow and just seeing, normally it's about people focus on past trauma and all these kind of buzzwords that are all surrounded the kind of shadow work that's talked about by Jung. So I don't like to talk about that stuff, not because I'm problematic with my my scars, but actually more about what I see as shadow work. So the shadow that is cast from your solar self. So there are aspects for me that I struggle with. I can accept that they are there, but there is a fear attached for me of what embodying my solar self would actually mean. So therefore, actually having that access to the rest is what I find problematic. So I don't know if you want to respond to that before we go back to trees.
So in order to do proper solar work, you need to have done the shadow self work first, right? I tend to equate it to, and I've used this example before with many people, that shadow work is like going into some deep, dark cave or tunnel. You can't see the exit. You just know that you're going to have to defeat and deal with anything that's in that fucking tunnel until the point where you see some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. How far is it away? You're not entirely sure, but you do go from seeing nothing and being in the deep pit of despair to seeing some sort of glimmer of hope, potentially. And then when you edge closer to that, as you escape and leave the tunnel, you are then entering into what I call solar work. Now, the interesting part about that is that the solar work technically starts whilst in the tunnel because you see the light and you go towards it. Shadow work for most people would be basically seen as going into the deepest, darkest, nastiest parts of their subconscious, which is that tunnel. And what you find there is very often, yes, trauma, but you find there all the deep, dark parts of yourself also, your psyche, personality, all of these things. It was also all of the blocks that you seek to, if you're trying to do solar self work, then you're trying to become a greater whole, because that solar self, that great sun, is what all of the planets and all of the things in the solar system are caught in the gravitational pull and surround, everything. It's a big, powerful position to be in and comes with a lot of power and responsibility. But to get there, you need to be worthy of being able to, or they would say worthy in the occult world. What it really means is you need to be capable of carrying the strain of the sun. Strain as in you need a considerable amount of strength. You really do need to be tested. You need to go to a lot of dark places and really get a fucking grip of yourself. And this isn't just some new agey way of getting to know yourself type thing. This is that actually, as humans, we are quite feeble and weak, and the human psyche is extremely fucking fragile. The solar self, remember, is, well, your totality of all your human lives and such, all of these various different things. So in order for one lowly human psyche to be able to carry the weight and the burden of all of those other ones on top of it, very fucking difficult. Shadow work's essential, and a lot of people don't come out the other end. They don't make it through the tunnel. We haven't lost anyone currently to the work, but there are people that go and do it on their own, whether they realize they're doing it or not, whether they realize what's going on or not, and they don't always make it out. And it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because much like a computer game, you can just reincarnate and
Start again.
and try again, and then you get bored and play a different game for a bit, and then inevitably you end up coming back a few lifetimes later. But either way, shadow work, deep embodiment look, dealing with all of the dark parts of you. Dark does not mean ethical, does it? It doesn't necessarily mean ethical. doesn't mean always sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies. What it means is the things that aren't currently, you don't have access to. So you are blocking yourself from. So whether that be a psychological blocks like trauma and stuff like that, or whether that be other forms of blocks that have been put upon you, like magical ones and such, all of those technically are almost like mapping out, but experiencing and pulling back in all of these different parts of you. And we call it shadow work because it's shadowy and dark, because symbolically, you can't see, can you? You can't see all of these parts that are a part of you yet. You have to explore them in the dark. You don't know what you're letting yourself into or in for. This is very scary. And one of the things shadow work is and isn't, things that it gets accused of being tend to be married up with techniques. So some people, Chris, like say, oh, shadow work's journaling, isn't it, and stuff like that. It's like, no, that might be a minor tool that starts to get you to get to that tunnel, or helps you guide yourself through that tunnel. Like the old Winchesters from Supernatural, they got their daddy's book, haven't they, which helps them guide them along. Your guide, there is a guide, of course. Your shadow self is your guide. But in order for you to make sense of all of the shit that you're going through on your shadowy working path, some people do decide to write about it or blog about it or keep journals and such like that, because it's really difficult to take on all of this information and process it at once. It's really difficult for the human brain to do that. But also, you're missing bits. You will be a complete fucking walking, talking catastrophe. And if you're doing that, you're really doing rather well, because you're able to walk and fucking talk. I've done a shadow ritual things years ago with people, and they can't walk. They're on the floor. Literally, they can't even get up. They've been so fucked up that they're basically rolling around on the floor like a crazy person. But that's shadow work. Shadow work is difficult.
I'm going to roll over it. I'm going to roll over it again.
Yeah.
Before we get to the meteor ends.
Oh, yeah.
Of kind of just pointing out again, reiterating, because this is a thing. Every time we talk about it, we think people have got it. And then you talk to them 6 months later and they really haven't.
Yes.
So I'm going to roll over it again. Liam has described it as a tunnel. That tunnel is somewhere between Luna and that solar self. But both the word shadow and moon should both be giving you that title. So we're not looking at reflection in the sense of we are reflecting on past, which is what people think about it as. We are seeing the shadow left and created by our solar self. So that light is coming from the solar self. That's what you were journeying towards. And what you were trying to walk through is the shadows left by it.
Yes.
So we're not talking about, trauma is this part. It's the lunar end. It's the very close to the earth end of it, the earthly embodiments of it. Then you're going to go push through that trauma. Now, for a lot of people, potentially if you've had not only a bad life this time, but multiple bad lives round, that is really hard. So you kind of need to get through the Jungian psyche stuff and figuring out exactly navigating that. And this is where people get bogged down with the concept of multiple past lives and multiple past traumas, and not focusing on the whole point, which is the whole point is that impression is left by the solar self. So that part that is core is leaving that energy, leaving that imprint on the ground for you to look at that goes, I can see the outline there. Which is what is missed on so many people, because they're looking for purpose. Now, this isn't about purpose, which is the bit that struggles for a lot of
Yeah.
people. Is solar, the ultimate goal is solar understanding, a holistic understanding of the whole of your being. This is not you just understanding this branch, but getting to the center of that tree. Now, funnily enough, if you look at the symbol for the solar, for soul, you'll kind of look at it and go, well, why is it 2 concentric circles often? And to me, that's the heartwood of the tree versus the rest of the sapwood around it. You are looking at a slice of the tree, which is kind of mind-bending, because we kind of covered this in the triangles one a couple of weeks ago. In that moment, we're talking about the fact that you were looking at a flat representation of something 3-dimensional. Well, actually beyond 3D, but let's not blow everybody's minds with Metatron's cube. But, you know, in its simplest concept, you are looking at something that appears flat, but isn't. And that solar point is that kind of point of the center at which those lower planets all circle around. The moon is only visible because of the sun. So with the solar looking and the searching for that solar, you've got to get past what is reflection. You get past the reflection and you start to look for the actual light source. And the reason for that is you can't look directly at the sun, which is why we focus so much on the moon, because it's just a reflection and we can cope with that.
Many can't.
But you're also looking at the moon in its various phases. There is still parts of it not visible. You know, at new moon, it's not visible at all. It's nothing but shadow. And that kind of is why kind of moon and lunar journaling was a thing. It's now been revived into some fluffy bollocks by the people that use mirrors to inspect themselves. Now, what we're trying to say is stop using the hand mirror, and you need to see the whole mirror. Now, at first, this is why full frontal mirror. That, you know, the reason for this is why full moon rituals originally existed. The whole point of a full moon ritual was there was maximum light, and you could view yourself in a liquid body. You know, you could actually look at the biggest mirrors available, water, in order to look at yourself, and kind of discovering through those distortions until you were ready to start searching for the source of those reflections. Now, I'm hoping that was a nice mix of slagging off the New Age and occult knowledge, but Liam will now tell me if I was correct in the delivery of that.
Well.
Yeah,
I think you did well. I think we did a good mix there. I still think, Chris, people still don't fucking get it, though. Partly because they don't fully understand what the fuck the shadow work is and why they would want to do it. But then the sort of people very often that go into shadow work and decide to go into shadow work do so because it's a trend on TikTok. That's very, very, very difficult. The sort of people that find themselves in shadow work are led there and forced to do it. You see, there's a very big difference between deciding to do shadow work, because you can start the process like anything in the occult. You can start the process. How far you'll get with it, it depends. But some people, the process is they're forced into it. And the ones that are forced into it need to make the journey. It's very difficult for them to go back and look back. Very often they can't because they're being forced to look into it. So we can go and we can diverge. We can talk about the magical occult science of how shadow work happens, how it's made, because it comes with some very fascinating manifestations, physical and etheric and magical and dream and all sorts of things like that. So how that actually works from a magical perspective. And then we can also talk about the experiences, I suppose, or we could talk about the experiences of people that go through shadow work, what they experience, what it actually feels like to be on that journey. I don't know if we do need to recapitulate what actual shadow work is, because it's a complex journey, a great work in itself. Ultimately, people don't even know what solar work is, so they're thinking, well, why would I want to go to the sun anyway? Higher self shit. But it's very difficult, because again, we've got many different people that are listening. So how far do we go with each?
What also is a struggle is, like I said, where I jokingly said Pluto earlier, is the fact that the solar self still only refers to, we talk about it as higher self.
Yeah.
But actually, all we're talking about is a combination of branch work. You're not talking about true whole self, because true whole self would require you having got through Pluto to the other side,
crossed the abyss,
and looked at yourself from the kether angle, and
highest
actually seeing
self.
you from the highest self as opposed to the higher self.
Yes.
So, I think, there's a certain aspect of kind of going, in order to understand what is entirely capable from you and your entire journey, is why you would look at solar work. And the main reason I think most people go to solar work eventually and have no choice but to go through the shadow work is because they get to a level of practice. So I think once you get out of that foundation stage and you've kind of mastered the basics of what is possible, at that point, there is a perspective shift. So at that point, you're kind of like, well, now I know all of that. This all seems very pointless. So what am I supposed to do next? And I think shadow work is kind of forced next, is for you to understand how all of those things connect up. And what the purpose, because that's what most people are looking for, is, why am I here? What's the purpose of being here? And if you get to the point where you see the only point of it is to exist and to experience existence, it then kind of goes, oh fuck, what am I going to do next? So the natural point at that point is to kind of go, well, okay, I need to understand the me's. I don't understand me anymore. I need to understand all of me, in order to know what really I want to do while I'm here. And I think part of that is getting to that point for choice and starting to understand, what to do next, what is worth doing. You have to have gone through that. Or what have I done before? What worked? What didn't work? Am I reliving a class I've already done? In which case, maybe I'll try something new. All those kind of choices don't happen until you can kind of sit in that seat and kind of look around you and look at the kingdom that is your life. And then normally the next thing people want to do after that is cross the abyss, because they realize there's not enough here.
They always want more, don't they?
They always want more.
Yes. So it's a difficult one, because in order to really get to grips with the process of how shadow work works on a magical level, so picking apart the component parts of shadow work, giving you some of the secrets of how the system itself works, or how you work on that level, or how creation works on that level, you've got to give away quite a lot of secrets about, well, the soul and such, don't you? And like after death, and different component parts and stuff like that. And some people are either going to understand it or they're not going to understand it. Either way, I think that should probably be kept for the Patreon. We'll see how far we get with that. But at the moment, we can start talking about the different paths, I suppose, between those that decide they want to take up shadow work, those that are advised to take up shadow work, and then those which shadow work is forced upon them by their shadow self. So I suppose we should go in that order, shouldn't we? So we'll go with the invalids first, the ones that don't realize, but they're jumping on some sort of, they've read the word shadow work in a book, or some person on TikTok or YouTube's mentioned it, therefore they think, oh, I might give that a go. It's another system of magic, surely. Oh, I want to do all different types of magic. I don't know who I am or what I'm interested in, but I'll try this, that, the other. I was a shaman last week. I'm going to do voodoo this week, and next week I might do the shadow work thing that they all talk about. I mean, I've already ordered my shadow work journal on Amazon. It looks pretty. I can't wait to use it, Mr. Chris. So, the plebs, those that decide they want to go about going towards shadow work. We've got about 4 minutes of the regular edition of the podcast. Let's talk about the vast majority of people. What do you think their understanding is first of shadow work, and then we can discuss whether that's right or wrong, or what our thoughts are.
Well, most of them will focus on Jung, regardless of whether or not they even know who Jung is.
Yes.
But they will approach it from that point of view because that's what's talked about. So they talk about moon journals, they talk about journaling, about dream journals, all of that is about studying our psyche or our unconscious mind. And that's what they tend to focus on. Oh, I need to understand more about me. I know where I'll look in the bit that's I can't control, the unconscious. So that most people will kind of focus on that as the reason for going. I need to understand where my drives and urges come from. Why am I as damaged as I am? Or is normally the answer to what they're looking for, is why am I so damaged? And that's what kind of focus on it. And that's where most people will then start to search through trauma. So they might accidentally stumble on the shadow self, but I don't think the process in which they follow is what actually happens. And I think that's where we normally pick people up, isn't it? And go, okay, well, what are you going to do about a shadow self ritual? How are you going to meet your shadow self? And they all look at you like, what? What is shadow self?
I've done the shadow work. I thought about how I was smacked as a kid, and it upset me, but I'm over it now. Although I'm not really over it because I can never be over it, but I accept it, you see. And I had counselling as well, even though I was offered cognitive behavioural therapy because that's the cheapest option and it didn't really work. But I still, how dare you tell me how to do my shadow work? What do you know? Is generally what you would get.
Generally speaking.
Which is just psychology and counselling at the end of the day, isn't it? And shadow work is far beyond that.
Which is important. Ultimately,
if
you've got baggage, you should definitely go and deal with your baggage before you try to put your big boy pants on and try and do some real magic. Because that baggage, no, you laugh, but ultimately that baggage is that thing that's going to potentially get in your way. If you go back to the triangle and you start to think about how that journey occurs between that power you've pulled in, where you want to send it, has to pass through Luna. If you don't have a stable Luna, then how are you supposed to make that transition well? And this is a thing, you'll get a lot of these that are damaged also happen to be naturals, and those naturals will just thunder punch it through. And that way they're kind of, well, they work, yes, but are you exhausted for days afterwards? Are you finding the rest of your life falls to shit the rest of that week? There will be an impact that occurs around you using the Thunder Punch method in order to actually get a job done. So it's kind of, people think of it as that. And what we're having to try and do is go, no, your solar self exists. And so does your kind of, for lack of a better word, lunar self. And in somewhere between those two is the shadow self.